Hi everyone, Alon Natsya, the CEO of October Health. Really excited to have Dharshni Padayachee with me. She's the head of DEI and Wellbeing at RMB, Rand Merchant Bank. She's had a super interesting career, a non-traditional one from a non-traditional bank. But you won't hear much about that from me. Let's hear directly from Dharshni. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thanks so much. So as mentioned in my intro, you've got a non-traditional background given where you find yourself today. So I would love for you to share a bit of your journey with our listeners.
Okay, so firstly, I am a chartered accountant sitting in a human capital team at the moment. I started my career at PwC in Durban, did my articles, and then came up to Johannesburg and found myself in the world of investment banking.
Big city.
In the big city, yes. I come from a very small town in KZN as well. And I started my career in group treasury in finance.
Okay.
So I did hedging, I did capital allocation, and all those lovely banking things. And 10 years into my career in markets, there was an opportunity to put our names in the hat to apply for the CFO role.
Okay.
And I went to bed that night and I got up in the morning and I said, no, thank you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I was good at it. I wasn't passionate about it.
Okay.
And so after 10 years, I thought, have I wasted the CA degree or not? And I started getting involved. I mean, RMB is this amazing place where once you've proven yourself, you can get involved in a lot of different things. And so I was executive assistant to the CTOO. So I worked in technology for 2 years. And then I was always more inclined to people, human development. I started getting involved in my spare time with our diversity committee, our gender equality movement at the time. And I found a real passion for it. And I found community around that as well. And I was doing so much of it that eventually I was asked to step full-time into the role. And that's how I found myself in a human capital world.
Yes, I'm sure you approach it in a very different way given that background.
I think, when you speak about diversity, it's cognitive diversity and just bringing different thinking into the room as well.
Yeah, and I think that it's about those skills that you learned during your CA career.
Yeah.
So there's one thing which, a little bit off topic, but I think will be relevant is, like, I know that often people may struggle with these decisions that they feel are existential, right? Like, should you become CFO or should you, pursue a different route in your career? Like, what advice would you give to people if they're struggling with that type of decision?
So I think the thing is that nothing's cast in stone, right? And there's no right and wrong decisions. There's only what's right and wrong for you. You can try something and change again. Nothing's stopping you from trying. But I think maybe the way we grow up is that we taught that everything has to follow a certain path. And we're quickly learning that there isn't only one path. And there's different ways of thinking about things. We shouldn't be so sort of caught with blinkers on to say, I'm only ever one thing. It's about widening your viewpoint and looking at it differently. But at the end of the day, it's what is the thing that's going to get you up in the morning? And sometimes that is a hard decision because it's a non-traditional decision. And there were mornings when I got up and thought, oh, have I done the right thing? And even now, there's sometimes I go, well, the numbers are maybe a little bit easier than people.
I don't talk back our opinions.
But there is no right and wrong answer. And I think the biggest thing or the biggest disservice we can do to ourselves is say, I should be doing something.
Yes. Well, I think that's great and that's practical. And I think you've just got to trust yourself, right? Yeah. But also making decisions, knowing that they're not forever decisions is also, I think, liberating, right? Because it takes a bit of the pressure off that decision.
Yes. And I think it's also the support around you. Not everybody will understand your decision, but if you've got those supporters around you that go, well, try it.
belief in the
Yeah.
community. And it's probably a great segue to another topic that we wanted to talk about, being social well-being.
Yes.
But before we get into that, I know everyone knows RMB is a great brand. Everyone knows that RMB is a big bank, but just how big is it? How diverse is the environment? Because I think that context will be valuable as we continue the discussion.
So I think RMB is a growing bank. It's a growing brand as well. We over 3,500 people, different geographies across not just Africa, but the world as well, and different locations, nationalities. It's a very, very diverse community.
Yeah, and that makes it more complex.
Yes, much more complex.
And the multiple locations, multiple countries, multiple teams, multiple focus areas makes it even more...
different professions.
True.
Yeah.
All of that makes it more difficult to navigate that
Yes.
type of environment. And I think the topic that we wanted to talk about was this topic of social well-being or community.
Yes.
Right? And the importance of that in the working environment and what that means for culture, what that means for productivity, what that means for intention. So maybe just to set the context, how would you define this concept of social well-being?
So I think when we think, traditionally we've thought well-being, we thought physical health, then we know mental health, a little bit of financial health, but we don't really think about the concept of social well-being and this human connection that's so linked to our well-being. And we're seeing more and more that the social aspect is, and the human connection is becoming more and more important, and it actually affects overall well-being, even our physical, our mental, etc.
Yeah. So I think that's super important. And I think like the irony of the world today is that we're more connected technology-wise than we've ever been. But if you look at the stats, we're probably the loneliest we've ever been as well, which is ironic and just doesn't really make sense. And I think part of that is the ways of work or the way people are approaching work. But I know you've got a very different approach to it, and you think about social well-being as being core to the culture. So how do you drive social well-being at a bank as large and as diverse as RMB?
So I think there's a few ways. A lot of it is about driving this community aspect, and there's different ways that you can do that. But it all requires being very intentional about it and intentionally trying to get people together for the right reason. So it's back to office for a few days a week. But the back to office is not about sitting at your desk and doing your work at your desk or sitting at your desk on Teams calls all day. There's a great opportunity for you to connect with your colleagues, for you to connect with people outside of your team, to build up your network, to leverage other thinking as well when you come into the office. So we're seeing the office more as a place of social connection rather than a place just to come and do your work. Or that's the way we'd like to see it. And I think, a lot of people talk about, like when we think social, you think that the parties and the weekends away and the team builds and stuff. That's really important, but it's one aspect. It's how can you and I connect over a lunch, even when we're sitting in the canteen together, or we're sitting outside in the sunshine and having a coffee together. I think the conversation becomes different, and the information that we share is different as well. It's not as transactional as if we were just having a meeting.
Yeah, you're there to achieve an objective and then walk away.
Yes.
So there's a lot there. And I think what's important just to unpack and explain is, one, I think that a lot of people may be listening and thinking, I'm under so much pressure, right, that I don't have enough time to do all these things on my to-do list. Like I can't take time away from my deliverables to have that coffee or have that lunch or build that relationship. So why are these aspects so important?
So I think that we need to redefine the concept of work, right? So work is not just my deliverable of my Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is. Work is also about having the connections, the network, the coffees. And if we can reframe that as being part of our work and not in addition to our work, I think that's one way of looking at it. Because if you can reframe it in your brain as this is my work as well, I think it makes a big difference. But the difference is also that it makes the work, the the spreadsheet or the deal that you're doing or whatever, easier as well. Because when you have a relationship with someone, when you have a social connection with somebody, it makes it easier to leverage that person. When you're picking up the phone to ask them for help or you ask them for something, they know who's on the other side because they've already got that human connection with you.
Yeah, so that relationship capital is so important because, I mean, ultimately you're not operating in isolation, right? You need to leverage experts and, to your point, diverse skills, diverse professions around you to achieve your objectives.
Yes.
So, again, I think you touched on two examples, like the coffees, the lunches, but how do people go about doing this, right? If you're in an environment, maybe you're not naturally an outgoing person,
Yes.
Who feels comfortable kind of putting yourself out there and, meeting people, being vulnerable maybe. How do you go about doing these things?
One coffee at a time.
Okay.
So we often think of when I was younger in my career, I thought that networking was going to these networking events. And believe it or not, I am an introvert. Well, I'm an ambivert, actually. But it was really intimidating to walk into an event and meet a whole lot of new people. It wasn't natural to me.
And it feels like everyone else knows each other.
Everybody
You're
else
one
knows
person
each
who knows.
other. I'm this awkward person standing there. But then as I went through my career, I realized there's other ways to build a network. There isn't just one way. And it could be that you do better in a one-on-one versus being out in a big group or at a big party or whatever it is. And I think what you do is you can leverage each person that you know. So if I know you and I want to know somebody that you know, it's asking for the introduction.
Yeah. So, I guess it's just, you eat an elephant one piece at a time,
yes.
right? You don't need to go into a room and make friends with 50 people.
You don't. And I think it's being intentional about who do you want to meet with? Yeah. Who do you want to get to know? And I think in my network that I could use at the moment.
Yeah, that's important. And I think often people think that people won't want to have those coffees.
Yes.
But I guess you also don't know until you try. And I think you'll also be surprised when you ask.
I think it's very surprising when you ask. Most people will say yes. Or they'll say, I can't right now, but I will.
Yeah, 100%. So, obviously in your role at RMB, you're doing this, you're trying to create the environment and the structure to enable this social well-being, right? And that's very much core to your portfolio, both from a DEI perspective and a well-being perspective. I think it straddles both.
Yes.
So how do you do that at an organizational level?
I think there's no silver bullet, firstly. So there's no one way of doing it. It's got to be multiple approaches and multiple ways that you do it. So I think it's really important to draw the parallel between DEI and inclusion and belonging and well-being, because there's a performance element there as well. When I feel like I am included and I belong, it automatically increases my performance. And we talk about being in a high-performance environment. Well-being and high performance are not two opposite ends of the spectrum. And when we talk about well-being and the social well-being, it's really about, do I feel included? Do I feel like I belong in this organization? There's also different team cultures in the organization. So there isn't one overarching culture, but we have overarching values that are common to all of us. And it's leveraging those values as well. So we always say different teams must try and figure out what works best for them. There's no, we're not going to train anybody, but we're going to give you the tools and we're going to give you enough thought leadership and we're going to drive enough awareness around this. But it's not just a leadership issue. We always, at RMB, we say it takes the sum of us. And so there's a responsibility on us as employees and there's a responsibility with the leadership as well.
So I think there's a lot I'd love to unpack in more detail. I think you mentioned a couple of points. Obviously, R&B is a high-performing culture, right? So it's not like these things are an or, yes, right? It's not like, well, we're going to create social well-being or inclusion or diversity and compromise on our performance standards. These things go hand in hand.
It's not a human capital thing.
It's everyone's thing. So So I think that's, like, again, I think that's counterintuitive in some way. Going back to the point around, well, I'm taking time away from, my Excel spreadsheets to go get a coffee. How do you kind of change those mindsets and show people that investing in relationships helps them perform at a sustained level?
I think one is role modeling. So role modeling is really important, and role modeling from our leadership is really important. So if our leadership is investing in their own well-being, in the well-being of their people, if they are showing their people, it is not just about the spreadsheet. It's about, let's go out and have a lunch, guys, or, let me connect with you, even if it is through just our performance conversations, but we're really connecting through that. I think the role modeling from our leadership is really important. And then I think, like I said, it's those bits in the culture. So it's not about creating formal programs. It's about, I always say you have to nudge the culture a little bit at the time to show the value of connection. And with R&B, we always say we are a highly relational organization. You get a lot more done with who you know, and who's in your network as well, rather than here's the manual, here's the policy. Those are like the minimum standards.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think it applies in the way that R&B approaches clients, but also the way you think about your employee or your colleague relationships.
Yes.
Are there little tips? Your point, I think so many one-on-ones between managers and, their reports are about, what did you get done this week, right? Nothing about how's the family. Like, are there little nudges from that perspective that you encourage people to apply to their one-on-ones?
We do. So that it's around the conversation rather than around the tick box. And we encourage more of the conversations, and we equip our managers as well in those conversations. So it's not just, we do provide some of the tools on what is a courageous conversation. How do you connect with your people? Because we're also aware, like, it's sometimes technical leaders that become people leaders, and you're not always well equipped between those two. Like I said, it's harder to manage the people than the spreadsheet, right? Yeah.
So I think that's also an important point. I think we often see this, that you have the best individual contributors, right, who've had these amazing deal-making careers in the bank, and now all of a sudden they got to manage a team.
Yes.
And, some that comes naturally too, but for others, it's something that they've never done before. So how do people transition, and why is that relationship element so critical to the success of a leader?
So I think when you become a leader, you lead people, right? Managers manage the work, leaders lead people. And it's not always an easy transition from being a technical expert into a leader. The skill set is very different. And I know, like, traditionally it would have been called soft skills, but it's actually leadership skills, or it's human skills. And it requires looking at it in a different way. So our leadership programs as well focus a lot on that, because we know that technically you're great for the role, but there might be additional skills that you need as well, which maybe not always have been top of mind for you, because managing a team takes a different skill set. Being able to have a conversation takes a different skill set. But again, it's really about being intentional about it. And then that buzzword of psychological safety comes up so often. But it really is about creating that safety in the team. And when you have that safety, then you have trust in the team as well. And the relationships become easier.
Yeah. So, I think it's such an important point. We recently launched a workplace wellbeing report with Gibbs. And one of the key findings were that individual well-being, the two factors that influence that in the workplace. The one is trust and leadership, and the other one is psychological safety. And both of those, hearing you speak, are directly related to that social connection, right? Because you can't have either of those things without social connection.
Yes.
So it's good business, right? To get those things right.
And I think that trust also builds when you and I have a human connection, and not just, I think online provides great tools for us to connect, but there is also an element of human connection that's needed as well.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. And I think to your point again, this connection, it's authentic.
Yes.
Right. And I think, if you're doing things to tick boxes, that it's inauthentic. And I think people ultimately feel that. And you're not going to have true trust without authentic relationships.
I think people feel it, but also it takes a lot of your energy to try and be something that you're not.
Yeah.
So connection can come in different ways as well. There isn't just, like I said before, it's just not one way to do it. But an authentic hello, how are you, is common to everybody.
Yeah, I always laugh. I remember overhearing someone saying, hello, how are you, to someone, and the person like, I'm terrible, I'm so sick. And the person didn't even listen.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I'm so glad to hear. Yeah.
Sincere.
But yeah, it's as simple as that, actually listening to what people are saying.
Yeah. And that's such a great point, right? The listening.
Yeah.
Not listening to provide an answer, but just listening.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. I think people also think that, investing, I've got to have all the answers, but you don't, right? You just need to listen and actually care about that person and hopefully remember some things as well, right?
And I think as a leader, it's also important to know if something's going wrong, when to hand it over. That you aren't the well-being expert, or you aren't the medical expert, and you don't need to be. You just need to know when is the right time to be handing this over to the experts.
And I think it's such an important point because it comes back to that trust element. And if there's no trust, then your employees are not going to escalate issues earlier on. And the only time that these issues are going to become apparent are at a breaking point. Yes. Right? Maybe that individual's going to leave, or maybe that individual burns out. But if there was trust, they could have escalated that issue earlier on, or you would have picked up on those cues.
Yes.
To guide that person to the right resource. I know there's also a lot going on in the bank in terms of, other ways, quite innovative ways, gyms, etc., that you've done from an infrastructure perspective to make sure that it feels like home, right? Or you feel comfortable, you've got a community supporting you. What are some of those initiatives?
We've got wellness centers. So across the different regions as well, there's the medical wellbeing centers, doctors, nutritionists, those kind of facilities. We've got on-site gyms. And even there, there's great community that's built in the gym. It's not just about going in to do your exercise. We've opened an on-site childcare.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah,
that's
great. And it's also about trying to make the physical spaces more conducive to well-being. So what do the spaces physically look like? Is there enough space for us to get together as communities? Is there enough space for those that need quiet time? We're talking a lot about neurodiversity in the workplace and what that means in the workplace as well. And then there's the other sort of informal pods of communities, like we've got an R&B volunteers community. So these are groups of R&Bers that come together to do good in the communities that we serve. But one of the offshoots of that is a little knitting club that started.
Okay.
And they formed like their own little community. They share, I know nothing about it. But apparently it's great for mindfulness as well. But they're sharing patterns. They're supporting each other. And I think it's great that it's not always the organization that has to create these formal ways for people getting together, but you've got to allow the spaces for people to get together. Then the other thing we have is a lot of employee resource groups.
Okay.
So our most recent one is around disability. We've got one for the LGBT community. We've got a women's R&B Athena, it's called. And I think all of these spaces are really important for people to come together as a community for themselves. But then also there's other spaces where you interact with others.
So I guess it's about finding your sub-community within...
finding your tribe, finding your people. And that's really important.
Yeah. That's so powerful. And I think, I love the example about knitting. It's not about, you often think about employees getting together and doing things like soccer or drinking or,
I mean, there is the cycling, there's the soccer clubs, the netball.
But there's something for everyone,
but here's
right?
something that just happened organically, and now it's a little community.
That's awesome. So you mentioned you've got offices around the globe. You've got teams in different locations in South Africa as well. Obviously, it's easier for everyone on the main campus in Johannesburg to build community.
Yes.
But how do you ensure that, those that are in smaller offices, smaller locations can build or feel part of the broader R&B community?
So I think that's where technology has been great, and it's been really helpful. So in terms of well-being, we can't physically have activities on every campus. If there's a talk, if there's a webinar, if there's something like that happening, because of technology, we can introduce that to everybody, and everybody can participate. But it's also, again, being really intentional about visiting those campuses, making people feel like they are included, they are heard, their voices are valuable. It's being intentional about them coming to Johannesburg, visiting us. Once a year, we have the R&B conference, and everybody or representatives from all around the world from our offices come to Sun City all together. So again, it's intentional actions to make us feel like we belong.
Oh, that's awesome. And I think you have to be intentional about it, but they're also not, I guess, these impossible things, right? Or they also don't have to be very expensive things.
They don't have to be very expensive, and they don't have to be all the time. But when you do it, it must be impactful as well.
Yeah. I think something which, from the outside in, I've noted on R&B, and, I want to talk about this in the context of belonging, in the context of social well-being, is that your attention seems to be really high. And I think I often meet people from the bank and they've been there for 10 plus years, which is...
I am one here.
which is really unusual, right? You don't meet people that, join an organization out of articles, as you say, and stick there for 10 plus years and have multiple careers within the organization. What is it, both, I guess, more broadly, but, and then, in the context of culture and the context of social well-being that you think the bank's getting right?
So if you had asked me when I joined, would I be there 20 years later? I probably would have said no, right? Because I think traditionally you would think if you're in an organization, you stay in the same role.
Yes.
But I think what's really great with R&B is, like I said, this access to opportunity. If you prove yourself, you get a lot of access to opportunity, and not just within your area. I've moved around multiple areas of the bank, and I've been given multiple opportunities. But again, it's around you making use of that as well. It's a very enabling environment where you're allowed to ask. You're allowed to speak up. You've got access to the leadership teams. They're not all sitting behind closed doors, and you can't, we always say we have that culture where if you need to talk to the CEO, you can go knock on her door, that kind of culture. But it's also allowing for some fluidity, for some flexibility. You're not stuck in a particular career path, which I think is really enabling. But again, it's a give and a take. It's how much you put in and how much you also take charge of your own career within the organization.
Yeah. So I think there's so much there that's so important. We talk a lot about this concept of a high agency mindset that
Yes.
I think you've really articulated beautifully, where the bank creates this enabling environment, but your ability to succeed or fail is really up to you.
Yes.
And it's your opportunity to really embrace. And I think the other point that you make is, in a bank like R&B, where there's so many different roles, so many different divisions, locations, etc., if you're not building those networks, and it's an important thing for people to think about, like, I shouldn't just be building a network with my team of 5 people or 10 people that I'm working with on a daily basis. Should be thinking about network in other divisions, in other areas, in other functions, because that's part of this culture of continuous learning.
Yes.
As well.
And I think there's something around being visible to those networks. And I think when you're young in your career, especially, it's really important to start building up your network from that point. I think we often leave it for too late, or we think it's only something I have to do when I'm a leader or I'm in a senior position. And we think of networks as maybe outside of the bank, not just, and if you start thinking about your network can start in the bank, and your network can be these colleagues who are outside of your team, because you need different people for different things as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's another concept, is that continuous learning, right? If you're only with people who are in your direct environment, your ability to learn things that you're not exposed to is more limited. So going back to this core concept of social well-being, they're all, it's not just about the relationships. It's about, perspective. It's about having stakeholders who can vouch for you, who can open up doors for you. I know luck is something that people often talk about. And
we talk about the concept of sponsorship as well, and how important that is in your career. But we never talk about that you must be sponsorable as well. And you've got to show that you are somebody that I would want to sponsor.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's great. And that kind of saying on Lunk, and I'm going to butcher it slightly, but it's about increasing your surface area so you can become more lucky.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
If you're going to be sitting at your desk and no one's going to know who you are, right, and maybe you'll do a good job and you might get lucky that way, but the more people know you, the more that you're building that brand, building that network one-on-one, right? You don't need to go and give presentations to the whole bank on day one. The luckier you'll get.
Yes. And I think that's something that we don't really think about in the transition to work when we're leaving university. Because putting your head down and being the best in your class and doing the work got you to where you are. But then it changes, the rules change when you're in the workplace, and what's required change to be successful changes when you're in the workplace.
Yeah, so I think that's so powerful, and I know we're at time, so I'll use it as a point to finish off on, where I think it's the what you do in the bank, but how you do it.
Yes.
And probably who you do it with as well, right? About building those relationships, and especially important for those early on in their career, because you're just not used to that environment. And something which you also said earlier, which I think was so important, is for people earlier on in their career, if they're not building those relationships, they're not actually refueling themselves, and that leads to higher cases of burnout. So investing time in relationships actually enables this high performance culture.
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Already chatted and time flew by. I think, thank you to everyone for joining. We chatted through so much. I think if there's one takeaway, it's just the power of social well-being, of social network. I think it's something that hopefully everyone who's listening can, take a practical takeaway and apply to your day-to-day. And every organization can invest without something costing them a huge amount of money. So huge benefits, very little investment. That sounds like a super positive ROI. So hopefully you enjoyed our chat, and thanks to Dharshni for joining us.
Thank you.
Awesome.